Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Along with me, as always, is Mike.
Hey
Uh,
everybody.
Mike, this will be an interesting one for us today. A topic that I don't really know where I'm at on, and I think you kind of are similar on this. And the flashpoint for this announced this week a new V for Vendetta TV series is in development. This is obviously was made a movie 20 years ago based on the classic Alan Moore graphic novel. Which me and you will be breaking down here pretty soon in our Watchmen challenge. That's our next book up after the long Halloween. But some comments kind of resurfaced when this was announced from Alan Moore. And Alan Moore talked a bit about why he does not like the cinematic adaptations of his work. And look, Alan Moore's a grump. He doesn't like anything, it seems. But he
Yeah.
did raise an interesting point in that to kind of summarize what he mainly stated is they never really get it right. And he wrote those stories as comic book stories, not as movies. And his whole kind of main supposition is movies are always better when they were always intended to be a movie and written as such. And comics will always be better when they were written as comic books because that's what they were supposed to be. We now live in a world, Mike, where we had a 20-year comic book boom of movies. That's slowly dying, though we're still probably going to get a few big ones. But the question I'll pose to you is kind of like Alan. I think if we take Alan Moore's comments and another V for Vendetta adaptation, because we're seeing over and over again. Mike, do you think comic book movies stopping altogether would actually benefit the comic book industry? Do you think do you
Oh,
think,
that's
because Alan Moore kind of suppositioned that it took these comic book characters and made them movie characters that they were never supposed to be. And that's where it's a pale imitation and it has ended up hurting comic books. Do you agree with him? Do you disagree? If you unpack all that he's going through there, what do you think?
so I think he said like the the comic books were never meant to be movies and movies were never meant to be comic books, and that the comic book movies were going to end up bringing down the comic book industry. So I don't know the sales figures over the last 20 years. I roughly understand that the publishing end has been in decline, and you and I have, you know, uh, expressed
Covered
our
that a lot.
frustrations on all the missed opportunities where the movie could industry could have built up the publishing industry
Hmm.
in the process. But they didn't. As they raced to the cash box, they just stole all the IP that they could and threw up all over the movie screens for 20 years, all
Yeah.
these amazing movies. And they just left the publishers in the dust. I do feel Alan Moore has a very valid frustration between the two mediums. Um, and, his work is iconic and classic. And when he writes a story, he really writes a story. And
Hmm.
he usually works with really good artists, and they put together masterpieces, probably some of the best of all time. And Watchmen is one of them that we've reviewed here on the channel. We'll put a link to it. And we're about to do another one in about 12 to 13 weeks when we finish the long Halloween.
Yeah, we gotta get through the.
But um, But Watchmen was adapted too, and it became a movie, and then it became a TV series. He's right; they mostly get it wrong, and I have although I don't think they were detrimental. Movies were detrimental to comics. I do think they probably kept a little gas in the tank as the publishing end was sputtering these last 20 years to keep enough of the floppy fans interested in going to their local comic book shop
Hmm.
and seeing what was on the stand, for what, related or not to the movies. The characters were still there for them to buy. And so I do think that it may have actually propped up the publishing end just a little, although it could have done so much more and it didn't. So in that regard, That's what I have to say about that. I think it probably kept it afloat a little bit longer than it might have otherwise had there been no comic book movies. Now we're in this drought of movies, and we just have the comics. The comics is where the ideas come from. This is your idea farm. And this is what Alan's talking about. And I don't know that we need a V for Vendetta TV show. I'm sure there'll be a lot of money thrown at it and a lot of talent, and it has the potential to be very good. I do like the idea of a comic book series like V for Vendetta adapting to a serialized television show where they get more than 2 hours to develop.
Hmm.
And I do think that that is a better format for some of these longer stories, although nothing will, get Alan more excited about, number one, he's not getting any money from it. And number two, they're going to take his, redo it like movies always do. Um, so it's just kind of weird. But from the beginning of when we started this, and you and I always talked about the confluence between the movies and the comics, I've always tried to express the fact that please know that movies are just movies. They're a different, as much as we want to try and hold them to their source material, movies are always just different. And you almost have to accept it as an Elseworld story for your character A, B, or C, and just kind of run with it. Sometimes they do it well, although it's different because it's always different. And sometimes they do it terribly, and then you're disappointed.
Yeah, I think the weird thing is I think Moore raises a couple of interesting points. One is a movie. Is it almost saying like the comic book medium's not good enough at telling that story, and I have to do a movie version of it to really make it a great
Mm.
story? I don't think that's what they're trying to do, but I understand his point, especially if you create. We love Watchmen as a comic book. I can only imagine if I created Watchmen, wrote it, made that come to life from my brain, and then someone adapted it and, in my opinion, butchered it, how mad that would make you be, right? Same thing
Yeah.
with stuff for V for Vendetta. Certainly, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is one of his comics that the movie did not do justice to the story.
They
So I
they kind of
understand.
they kind of took the ball and ran a different way with that one,
Yeah,
didn't
God love him, but yeah, not Sean Connery's finest hour. With that,
they?
uh, so I understand his point. What I will say is, do I think movies have hurt comic books, and do I think it might be better? There's a part of me that has gotten around to saying I think this has been a net negative. And part of why I think that is I kind of feel like sometimes now comic books are writing the book for the cinematic potential, not for the actual comic book itself. I think this is why we get, like you pointed out, it started to be where like we're introducing characters that I don't think were ever meant to be in the comic book world what they are, but like Marvel, and they will tell you till they're blue in the face that this had nothing to do with it. But around the time that Mark Ruffalo, Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, and Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr., that shows you how much those two characters are like. Um, Around the time those guys were getting
One
real
and the same.
expensive, yeah, around the time they were getting real expensive and nearing the end of their contracts, Marvel Comics decided to make a new character, the Hulk, a new character, Thor, a new character, Captain America, and a new character as the Iron Man character. Now,
Yeah.
happy coincidence, maybe, but from the outside, you could
Mm.
look at that and go, this seems to be our backup plan for when we have to write Robert Downey Jr. out of the universe because he's either A, gotten too old, or we don't want to cut him that $65 million check to be Iron Man. And I
Mhm.
think we saw that, and it definitely negatively impacted the comic book world if that's the case. And it's hard for me to believe that wasn't intentional, given that was right around the time Disney bought in and bought Marvel and took full control over everything that you started to see those stories come to the forefront, which kind of seemed like this is us
But here's the
establishing
thing.
canon so we can replace them in the movies. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, and see, I think we're going off in the wrong direction there. It's like if the movies want to go there and have a new Iron Man, that's fine, but we could still have Tony Stark in the
Steve
comic.
Rogers.
They are separate. When we try to make the movies the comics, because, like Alan Moore said, then the comics will just be made to make the movies, which is what the bean counters want.
Hmm.
That
It's an
they see
IP.
this as,
An
this
IP
is
farm.
it's an IP farm to mine for movies and television. Um, but where the true creativity comes in is thinking about, like when Alan Moore was writing V for Vendetta, when he was writing Watchmen, he wasn't thinking about television and movie rights. He was, thinking about
He
making a
was
good
writing the
comic
best
book
comic
story,
book story he
which
could
is
write.
where true which is where the true magic begins. And if you have billions of dollars like Disney, and you want to take that and throw it up onto the screen and make movies out of it, it's never going to be the same. It's going to be something different. And it's a tricky road to go down. And I see why Alan Moore is thinking that way, that because we've actually seen that come to fruition where um, they're just writing in characters because they're gonna put them in a movie soon, and that's not really the place where you want to be. Like I said, the true magic begins when there's nothing else but the writer and the artist and the comic book and the printed page. That's where the true magic comes in. And if
I
later somebody else wants to do something, it's going to be something different.
think this is why we're not getting as many classics anymore with comic books. And that what is interesting,
Yeah.
I don't know outside of Conan that we both love. I don't know any comic book in the
No.
past 20 years might be broad, but it might be 20 years. I don't know any comic in the last 20 years that I think 50 years from now people are going to be like, that's a classic. You got to read that one. We seem to have
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
80s, 90s, 70s, they all seem to have those. I maybe I'm wrong. I don't know any story
Yeah.
from the 2000s on that I'm like, oh no, no, no. Like where I go tell my kid if he's like, Dad, I want to read comics. And I go, oh son, you gotta read this one. I think I'd point him towards Frank Miller's runs and Alan
Um,
Moore's stories and Herbie and Lee. I do you think movies might be why that is the case?
Maybe so. I mean, it's hard, and we should go back and kind of look. There was some stuff in the New 52 that was amazing, but there was stuff that was really bad. There
Yeah.
was some, uh, I don't know.
No, I mean,
There was
in
Flashpoint.
all honesty, Mike, you've been reading these since
Flashpoint was a classic. That was a modern
Flashpoint.
classic.
I mean, I get yeah. But you've been reading these since when was the last time you read one that you were like, oh, this is Watchmen-esque. This is Batman Year One-esque. This is one I'm gonna break out and read 20 years from now. I think
Flashpoint.
Hickman's Fantastic Four,
Hmm.
uh John's is Green Lantern, some of Snyder's Batman, and Conan are the only run, the current Conan from Zub are the only runs that I was like, oh, when I'm 50 or so, I'll want to read this again. Or
Okay,
like,
so
oh,
let
20.
me
I don't know
let's
any others.
let's turn the table, and let's say, okay, so somebody goes to Heroic Signatures and Titan and says, "Hey, we want to make a new Conan movie based off of Jim Zub's scripts."
Hmm.
I
Well,
mean,
that's a great question. Like, would I be excited? I'd be excited, obviously,
I would too.
but would it top the comic? I don't think it would. And I think
It'd be hard
part
to.
of what has made Jim Zub's run as good as it is I don't know how much cinematic potential's in that. And that he writes, I think, really great comic book stories that you could expand into a movie for sure.
Mhm.
But one of the things that's made his run so great is it's relatively short arcs that all kind of get broken up and then you move to a different pivot point. And I guess you could make a great movie out of it. I'm like not in any way demeaning what he's writing. Just I think he effectively uses the comic book medium
He's a
with no
master
thought
at
of
it.
like, oh, this would be a cool scene in a movie. There are scenes he does where like obviously that would look cool, but I don't know. Even like what they're doing. It was announced that Redcoat, right? Redcoat's getting a movie adaptation,
Oh, that's right. That just came out this week, right?
and while that could be cool, do I think it will be what the book is? Do I think? I don't know how you capture that. I guess maybe you just take the first six issues and you do what you can. But
I
I
don't
think,
know. I don't
well,
know
then
about
like
the red coat.
this is the other part of this that's interesting. Is you pointed this out. You kind of have to movie world, comic world, right? And that you're never going to have an actor who's more Batman than Batman appeared on the page in the comic book. No matter how much you cast whatever actor you want, they're never going to look more like Bruce Wayne than he does in the panel. It's very similar to when you read a book. I've read Count of Monte Cristo probably 35, 40 times. I don't know what actor you cast that I'm like, oh, that's Edmond Dantes. Because it's probably never going to be enough because the version that's in your head, there's
Yeah.
no one that is going to be the physical manifestation of that. Really.
So that's the medium between the novel and the movie. And in between lies the wonderful world of comics.
Comic
Because
books.
and that's it's the perfect medium, like Neil Adams said, it's the perfect medium, and it really is. Um, yeah, you and of course, since the 50s, and probably even before, Disney and them, they started drawing the storyboards. Like
Hmm.
certainly Alfred Hitchcock storyboarded all of his stuff, and because they understood the power of that still image and how to create a moving image around that. And every movie's done that way now. Storyboard artists are awesome, but yeah, it's not going to be the same. And there's a certain magic that happens between creators, writers, and artists when they create a good comic book. There's a certain magic, and that's captured in time. And then when you take it into the motion picture industry or television, something is lost in translation. And like I've always said, I grew up in an era where there were no superhero movies. And
Hmm.
then in 77 or 78, Christopher Reeve,
Yeah, Superman 70. Yeah.
yeah, came out and Superman was amazing. And, right away as a kid going to Superman movie, you realize like, okay, this is different. But it's really cool to see him flying on the movie screen.
Yeah.
And, but you understood those differences. And having that happen in my childhood, in my comic book buying years, gives me a little bit of maybe an understanding because comic book fans are really harsh on the movies for not being close enough to the comics. But there was always that distance between me and Superman and my Superman comics, as there were when Batman came out in '89 and Batman comics. Although it was great to see Batman on the screen, a kind of like a wink and a nod in my brain is like, it's not going to be comic. This is something different.
Yeah.
And I think we pigeonhole ourselves into thinking that the movies need to be more like the comics. And now we're in this weird world where the comics are trying to be more like the movies. And that's not where we should be.
No, it's so weird in that I have always saw myself being hypocritical about comic books in that probably tied with Batman for my favorite fictional character is James Bond. I think he's maybe
Right?
one A, one and one A.
Yeah.
I cut a tremendous amount of slack to the movies because, in all honesty, I love Ian Fleming's novels. They're fantastic. The Bond of the movies is not the Bond of the books. They're two different
No.
characters. Now, ton of similarities as far as, British spy, gets a lot of girls, saves the world, fights Spectre, cool gadgets, drives the cars that are cool and all that. But it's different. But Book Bond loses and doesn't get the girl sometimes. He's a little morose and Movie Bond, you want a little happier. And I've never really judged, like, I think Roger Moore is a fantastic James Bond. But if you read the books and then watch a Roger Moore James Bond, those are
Yeah,
not the same thing. And
no,
so, like, I've always cut more grace to the Bond films than I have, say, a comic book. And then if a comic book movie did the equivalent of Roger Moore's James Bond to the source material, I'd
mm,
probably be pretty ticked about it and be like, what is this crap? You guys don't know what you're doing. And so
right.
I think, like you said, there's probably a happy medium. It's one of these things where Alan Moore is actually unquestionably right on this, and that you're never going to adapt a comic book perfectly. And
Mm.
I sometimes he can be the craggly old man that we get like, man, he hates everything. But I understand it. I get if you craft it as a comic book story and then some Hollywood person's like, oh, I can make it better as a movie. And then you see it and they compromise it and change things, you'd probably tick you off quite a
And
bit.
there's the added element of frustration that creators must go through in that their story, which probably reached, maybe 100,000 readers or what have
Mhm.
you. If it was a really famous comic book, maybe 1 million readers. And then it gets put out on the big screen or even the small screen. And now you get, 20 million, 50 million.
Yeah, even if
Uh,
it bombs, it's 10x the audience.
yeah. And so this big audience who never read the comic or are going to see it, and you're not happy with what they're watching, and yet your name is on it because you're the creator of the source material. And
Mhm.
that's got to be a bitter pill to swallow. It really does.
No, it's a great example that, like, my son's gotten more into reading comic books lately just because he wants to read classics. And I give Marvel and DC a ton of credit. These compact editions and stuff like that have got him reading those. And he's always like the Avengers movies. And so he finally was like, hey, well, where's the Thanos comic book? And so I gave him, Infinity Gauntlet, the story. And he read it and he's like, Thanos isn't Thanos at all. Like, this is not. And you can imagine, well, it worked successfully in the theaters. If you were the person who created Thanos, you probably would watch that movie and be like, this is not the character that I. And yet, the prevailing vision of Thanos, a character you created, is this alternate version who physically looks good. He's got the gauntlet and the stones and all that. But yeah, I get it. I guess to close it out, Mike, do you think comic books would be better off if the cinematic adaptations went away going forward?
Oh, man. We're in this weird place where the industry is kind of struggling. The publishing industry is struggling. And I do feel like there is some push for, I don't know this for a fact, but and even though, what's published never matches up with what comes out or gets released, a huge frustration for you and me, because it could have been so much more supportive of the publishing industry. But I
100%.
do kind of feel like when the movies come out, that, some of the old soldiers and some of the younger soldiers like you do, loosen up the wallets a little more and buy stuff off the wall,
Hmm.
even though it's not related, or we try and drag our kids in and try and get them interested in what's on the wall. And so I do feel like it does have a little bit of lift for the publishing industry. It keeps the lights on, because the bean counters know that if we, you know, crack the whip down at the IP farm and tell them to dream up a couple of new characters.
Yeah.
Some artists and writers get jobs for a little bit longer. I do think it's helping in that way minimally, although it, like I said, you got to separate the two, and you got to let these comic book creators be comic book creators, and then from what they give you, see if it's movie worthy. Don't try and work it the other way, because I think that's a backwards way of thinking, and I think it only leads to, a spiral. It's just going to get, you know, um, kind of like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's going to diminish your returns, I do believe.
Yeah, do I think it would be better for comic books if the comic book movie and stuff went away? Probably. But I also know it wouldn't mean anything if we don't get better writers. And I think that's the biggest thing of this is I understand Alan Moore's frustration because he's Alan Moore. And regardless of whatever weird stuff he's been involved in and his impact on the comic book world overall, which we can argue the merits of whether he himself was good or bad for comic books. There's no question he could spin together an amazing yarn when he needed to. But
Absolutely.
what I will say is, even if the MCU had never been a thing, I don't think the current comic books we have would be doing better because of it. I think it's if there's people trying to say that our modern comics would be perceived better if comic book movies went away, I don't think that's true at all. I
No.
think if the movies went away, I do think it would help the industry because I do think the industry would finally stop looking at comics as let's create something that's just intended to be a cinematic adaptation. So I think that would help in
Right
that end.
there.
But that's not the reason comics are not as good now. The reason comics are not as good now is the dedication from the artists and the writers isn't there. We don't have long form storytelling anymore. We don't have dedication from a creative team to stay on a book for years. We have the publishers canceling books after 10 issues, so they never have a chance to fully go together. There's a ton of issues that are hurting the comic book industry. I don't think that's the biggest one. I do think it's interesting, and I do think it's an interesting conversation. I'd be interested to see folks' thoughts on. Do you think movies have actively harmed the comic book industry? And do you think it's almost as Moore takes it like an insult, saying that the comic medium itself is not a sufficient storytelling mechanism,
Mm.
and that they need movies? Because that's a lot of what he says too. But be interested to see your guys' thoughts down below. As always, folks, let us know what you think. Thank you for watching. God bless you. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.